Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our tech webinar on VAT on e-commerce for non-resident. VAT for non-resident on e-commerce activity and tax on salary. Thank you all so much for spending your time in joining our webinar this morning. Quickly introduce myself. My name is Fausia, to be known as Yali, Tax Manager of DFDL Tax Practice Group, and today I will be a moderator of the webinar this morning. Today, we have two speakers who are very well experienced about the tax advisory in Cambodia. Firstly, Mr. Clint O'Connell, our partner, Deputy Managing Director of DFDL, and he is also the head of Tax Practice Group in DFDL based in Phnom Penh. And secondly, Ms. Wajirawan Jamnan, our Senior Tax Manager of DFDL Tax Practice Group. Today as well, we have two important topics to cover. Firstly, VAT on non-resident e-commerce activity, which will be conducted by Clint and Rawan. And secondly, the tax on salary, which will be conducted by Rawan. Given that this is the online webinar, we suggest that all our participants can drop your question in our chat box, and our team will select your question for further discussion during the Q&A section as much as we can at the end of this webinar. If you have any issue in relation to the sound of this webinar, please kindly drop us the message and then our team will deal with it immediately. With no further delay, I would like to invite Mr. Clint to be on board with us to conduct the presentation on the first topic today. So please join me and welcome Mr. Clint on board. Thank you.
So thank you, Jelly, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce the topic today for VAT and e-commerce. And I hope that I can give you some background and some information for you to take away with respect to these recent updates. If we can move to the next slide, please. So the agenda for my discussion this morning would be looking very briefly at the global trends with respect to the taxation of e-commerce, moving on to Sub-Decree 65, which was passed earlier this year as a precursor to the Prakas 542, and then also the actual Prakas 542 and the salient points. And then my colleague, Ms. Ravan, will go through the simplified VAT registration process. Next slide, please. Next slide. So those of you who follow global trends with respect to taxation would be aware that there's been a large amount of publicity in recent times with respect to taxation of e-commerce. We have the discussions at the OECD level with BEPS, the base erosion profit shifting, and recently we've heard about developments including Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, which talk about the allocation of profits to jurisdictions for a multinational company and also a minimum corporate tax rate. The basic issue behind taxation of e-commerce is that typically multinational companies that provide e-commerce activities do not need to have bricks and mortar in the jurisdictions in which they conduct their trade. And that means it's difficult often for those jurisdictions in which the trade takes place to be able to tax those e-commerce activities. And so we have recent development around BEPS and OECD. Of course, Cambodia is not a member of BEPS and is not a OECD country, but Cambodia is not immune to these developments. And in recent times, there have been some changes to the taxation regime in Cambodia to deal with e-commerce, particularly around the definition of permanent establishment, and also the topic for today, which is VAT on transactions by non-resident e-commerce suppliers. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the key regulations that we would be that we are looking at this morning include the law on taxation, the Sub-Decree 65 on the implementation of VAT on e-commerce, which was passed earlier this year, and Prakas 542, which was just passed earlier this month. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we start with the law on taxation. So the law on taxation in Cambodia has a chapter on value added tax. And in that chapter, there is Article 75, which talks about the liability for the collection and payment of VAT. And Article 75 provides that there are special conditions for the liability of the purchaser to collect VAT where the supplier is not registered for business in Cambodia. And in the event that this circumstance occurs, there would be a sub-decree to provide further information as to how that VAT would be collected. Next slide, please. So to that extent, Sub-Decree 65 was passed in April this year, and the purpose and goal for Sub-Decree 65 was to define special conditions and a rollout mechanism for the implementation of VAT on digital products and services that are consumed in Cambodia and provided by non-resident taxpayers who do not have a permanent establishment. The coverage of Sub-Decree 65 applies to the e-supply of digital products, digital services, and e-commerce activities. Next slide, please. So Sub-Decree 65 contains some key defined terms. If we look at the definition of digital services, it refers to services that are provided via an electronic system. Digital goods refers to intangible products that are ordered, supplied, and delivered electronically. And electronic commerce refers to the activities of purchasing, selling, leasing, or exchanging products or services. Next slide, please. Now, we were supposed to have an online poll, but unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, we cannot do that. But if you'd like to take the test yourself, the question is essentially, which of the following activities constitute an e-commerce activity? And the examples are the purchase of a computer online, subscription to Netflix, advertising on Facebook, an online medical consultation, or all of the above. So if you answered 5, all of the above, your answer would be correct. And I think the key point we're trying to make here is that for the purpose of this VAT registration, and also for the purpose of the VAT reverse charge mechanism, which I will explain later, the definition of e-commerce activity is of vital importance. And as you'll see in the next slide, e-commerce activity is defined very broadly. So the annex to Sub-Decree 65 provides a non-exhaustive list of what is considered to be e-commerce activities. And as you can see, it's a fairly comprehensive list of activities that we're looking at. So we can't go through all of these activities today, but over the following slides, I will try to give you some examples for your reference. Next slide, please. So the list or the annex in Sub-Decree 65, we can broadly put into 4 categories. We have online purchases of tangible and intangible goods, software licensing and related services, online auctions and online services, and finally advertising and streaming. Next slide, please. So some examples for online purchases, it includes ordering tangible products online. So for example, if you were to order perfume from an online website and that perfume was to be delivered to you, that would be considered to be a e-commerce activity. Additionally, if you were to order and download digital products, which you would use either for private or commercial use, the example provided is if you were to acquire images from Shutterstock online, that would also be regarded as a e-commerce activity. Next slide, please. The next category, software licensing and related services, includes such things as limited duration software. So that could include, for example, antivirus software, which has an expiration date after a limited period of time. Also includes software or other digital products, such as software as a service or platform as a service, software maintenance services, and also data warehousing. Next slide, please. Online auctions and online services. So that extends to well-known examples such as eBay or web store. Also, interestingly, for online services, it includes examples such as if you were to receive an online consultation from a professional such as a lawyer or a doctor. It includes applications whereby you could also seek professional online services. Next slide, please. And finally, the final category is advertising or streaming. So advertising would include online advertising such as search engine marketing, display advertising, social media advertising, and streaming online. Most of you will be aware of examples such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, or HBO Max. So these are some of the examples under these 4 broad categories. But I think it's key to note, and probably if you are a tax advisor or a non-resident, it would be important to go through the list that's annexed to Sub-Decree 65 to make sure that the activity that you are providing or the activity that your client may be paying for in Cambodia, whether or not that activity falls under the activities listed in the annex to Sub-Decree 65. Next slide, please. So Prakas 542, which essentially provides further clarification on the implementation of Sub-Decree 65. It was passed earlier this month on the 8th of September. So who is impacted by Prakas 542? The first class of entity, if you like, that is impacted are non-resident taxpayers. And here we are looking at non-resident taxpayers who supply digital goods or services or e-commerce activities to customers in Cambodia. And again, we're looking at this definition of e-commerce activities and taking note that this is quite a expansive definition. So if you are a non-resident taxpayer and you supply digital goods or services or e-commerce activities to customers in Cambodia, and you have annual turnover of Khmer Real 250 million or USD 62.5 thousand per annum, or if you expect to have turnover of 60 million Khmer Real, which is approximately 15,000 USD in any 3 consecutive months in a calendar year, if you meet that threshold as a non-resident taxpayer, you are now required to register for VAT with the General Department of Taxation in Cambodia within 30 days. Now, because the Prakas was passed and is effective from the 8th of this month, it's highly probable that some non-resident taxpayers will exceed the threshold of expected threshold of 15,000 USD in any 3 consecutive months. So it's highly probable that some non-resident taxpayers will be obliged to register for VAT in 2021. Next slide, please. So what happens if you are a non-resident and you register for VAT? Well, the first thing to note is that you will need to prepare a report which outlines the monthly transactions that you carry out in Cambodia, and that report will need to be submitted on a monthly basis to the General Department of Taxation in Cambodia. Next slide, please. And then there are different obligations dependent on the types of transaction that the registered non-resident supplier would enter into. So on a B2C transaction, which would involve the registered non-resident transacting with an individual in Cambodia, the VAT registered non-resident is required to issue invoices and collect and pay VAT from those individuals in a B2C transaction. Now, the invoice that's issued by the VAT registered non-resident will have to include the name, address, and VAT number of the non-resident taxpayer, the name and address of the customer, the invoice number and the date of issuance of the invoice, the description of the goods or services or activities that are being provided, and the invoice value for a B2C transaction would normally be inclusive of VAT. Now, the invoice can be in a foreign language, but it will also need to show either Khmer or English in the invoice in addition to the foreign language. Next slide, please. And for the B2C supply, the VAT registered non-resident supplier would need to submit a return and pay VAT to the tax department no later than the 20th if it's filing a manual return, or the 25th of the following month if it's filing an e-VAT return. So to give you an example of how this would work, we have Company X, who is a non-resident taxpayer who is registered for VAT in Cambodia. Company X provides an online movie streaming service to Sadet, who resides in Cambodia, and issues an invoice to Sadet of $11 USD, which is inclusive of VAT for the month of November 2021. So Company X would be required to pay the VAT of $1 using the monthly exchange rate for November, and make that payment of VAT along with the VAT declaration no later than the 20th or the 25th of the following month, being December 2021. Next slide, please. And so just to illustrate this, for those who like to see illustrations, we have Mr. Sodet on the left-hand side. We have Company X, who is now registered for VAT in Cambodia. Company X issues the invoice to Mr. Sodet for the streaming services for $11, which is inclusive of VAT. On the right-hand side, you'll see that Mr. Sodet would have to pay $11 to Company X, as stated in the invoice, and Company X would need to declare and pay the VAT of $1 to the tax department by the 20th or the 25th of the following month. Next slide, please. So then the other type of transaction, which is contemplated under Prakas 542, is a B2B transaction. And that would be when we have a VAT registered non-resident that is providing e-commerce activities or digital goods or services to a tax registered customer in Cambodia, so a registered taxpayer in Cambodia. So the first point to note here is that, again, an invoice will need to be issued by the VAT registered non-resident. The invoice would need to contain the same information under a B2C transaction, but the important difference in a B2B transaction is that the invoice would need to contain the name, address, and tax VAT number of the customer as well, the customer being a taxpayer in Cambodia, and would also need to separate the taxable value and the VAT amount in the invoice itself. Next slide, please. Now, the key thing to note here on a B2B supply, and it's very important for those registered taxpayers who receive invoices from a VAT registered non-resident, is on a B2B supply, the VAT registered non-resident would need to disclose the transaction in their monthly declaration to the GDT, but they don't need to actually pay the VAT. The VAT under that scenario is actually going to be paid by the tax registered customer in Cambodia under the VAT reverse charge, which we will explain shortly. Next slide, please. Okay, so the VAT reverse charge, what is it and how does it work? So the VAT reverse charge applies when we have a B2B transaction which involves a registered taxpayer as the customer. So here we have a registered taxpayer who purchases digital goods, services, or e-commerce activities from a non-resident supplier. The registered taxpayer is going to need to account for the VAT on behalf of the supplier. And the keynote to be aware of is that the VAT will need to be accounted for the supplier regardless of whether the supplier has registered for VAT in Cambodia or not. So the payment of the VAT on behalf of the supplier by registered taxpayers under the reverse charge needs to be made to the GDT no later than the 20th or the 25th of the following month in which the supply actually occurred. The registered taxpayer who pays the VAT on behalf of their supplier to the GDT under the reverse charge mechanism is able to claim a VAT input credit even if the non-resident is not registered for VAT in Cambodia. So that's also an important point to note, and we will show some examples in the next slide to illustrate this. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have here a B2B transaction. So we have Company Z, who is a non-resident that is not registered for VAT in Cambodia. And Company Z supplies online images to Company Y who is a registered taxpayer in Cambodia. And company Z issues an invoice to company Y for USD $100. So what are the implications here? So firstly, company Y will need to pay $100 to company Z as per the invoice. Company Y will need to calculate VAT on the $100, and then company Y will need to declare and pay the VAT of $10 to the tax department by the 20th or the 25th of the following month. Company Y will be able to claim a VAT input credit of USD $10 in their December 2021 VAT declaration, which is the same month in which they received the invoice from company Z. So the key thing to note here is that, or there's actually a few things to note here, but I think the most important thing to note is that company Y needs to actually calculate and pay the VAT on behalf of company Z to the tax department under this reverse charge mechanism. Next slide, please. So in the second example, we have company Z again, but in this scenario, company Z, who is a non-resident, has actually registered for VAT in Cambodia. And so as a registered taxpayer, a registered VAT taxpayer in Cambodia, company Z issues an invoice for the online images to company Y, who is a registered taxpayer in Cambodia. Under the requirements in Prakas 542, the invoice that's issued by company Z has the amount of $100 shown, plus the VAT of $10 shown in the invoice that's issued to company Y. Now, if we look at the implications here, company Y needs to pay only the $100 to company Z. Company Y has to then pay the USD $10 VAT on behalf of company Z to the tax department under the VAT reverse mechanism by the 20th or the 25th of the following month. And then company Y will be able to claim a VAT input credit of $10 in their December VAT return. So even though company Z is registered for VAT in Cambodia as a non-resident, company Y still is obliged to calculate and pay the VAT on their behalf to the tax department under the reverse charge mechanism. Next slide, please. Now, some other key aspects to the invoicing obligation that are mentioned in Prakas 542. Firstly, with respect to the taxable value. So the taxable value for a supply is typically the amount that's stated in the invoice that's issued by the supplier to the customer. However, if the tax department in Cambodia does not agree with the amount that's stated in an invoice, the tax department in Cambodia has the right to redetermine a value which they believe represents the true value of the transaction or the consideration for the transaction. Also, with respect to time of supply, so you would have seen in the previous examples that the obligation to pay and declare VAT happens at the time of the supply. So for VAT purposes, the supply occurs at the earlier of when the invoice is issued, or the products or services have been delivered, or the payment has been received. In most cases, the time of supply would be affected when the invoice is issued by the supplier to the customer. For self-assessment taxpayers receiving the supply of digital products or services or e-commerce activities that must pay the VAT on the reverse charge, the time of supply is practically when the invoice is issued in most cases. Next slide, please. So there are some exemptions that are provided under Prakas 542. If you are a non-resident taxpayer, if you are a non-resident e-commerce supplier who registers for VAT in Cambodia, you would not be obliged to obtain an annual patent tax certificate. Also, with respect to taxpayers who are registered in Cambodia, if you are a small taxpayer, so I think most of you may be aware that in Cambodia, the classification of taxpayers are determined or split between small, medium, and large. So small taxpayers are predominantly sole proprietorships or partnerships that have annual revenue between 62,000 and I believe it's around 175,000 USD a year. So if you are a small taxpayer, you are exempted from the reverse charge obligation in Prakas 542 for a period of 5 years following the issuance of the Prakas, which was the 8th of September of this year. Next slide, please. So I'll now pass over to my colleague, Ms. Ravan, to go through the simplified VAT registration process for non-residents. I understand that there'll probably, you may have a number of questions, and if you can please be patient, we will try to deal with those questions following the conclusion of Ms. Ravan's talk. Thank you. Ravan, you're on mute.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Clint, for introduction and a very fruitful discussion on the VAT for the e-commerce activity. So now, as Clint mentioned, for me, I will provide a brief, the procedure for the VAT registration for the non-resident supplier who does not have a permanent establishment in Cambodia. And you will see what are the requirements for the register and the fee, also the kind of the supporting document after they receive from the registration. So from this slide, you can see that the non-resident supplier who provide the supply with the digital goods or digital service and e-commerce activity, if they has the annual turnover more than 250 million Khmer Rials. I believe Clint already mentioned in his part previously, and also if they expected to have their turnover for the 3 consecutive months more than 600 million, more than 60 million Khmer Rials occurs by Prakas 542. They are required to register for the purpose of the VAT payment, and it is called the Simplified VAT registration. And the question next is how they can register if they are in overseas. To answer this question, the Prakas also provide 2 options for the non-resident supplier, whether they can register via the portal of the GDT, we call e-registration, through the website of the tax authority, as you know, where that www.tax.gov.kh, or they can assign any tax agent to have them to register at the Department of Taxation physically. So for this registration, actually, we have checked through the GDT website and understand that currently they are in the process of development this portal. So hopefully it will be applicable soon. So it will be easy for the non-registered, they can registration by online. So can you move to next slide? The next slide here, we discuss about the requirement for the registration of the non-resident. So as you can see in the column green, when you want to register the VAT, we call simplified VAT registration. First, you need to complete the VAT registration application form, which we believe that it will have like the name, or you have like the company information, bank account, yes. And also, they also need to supply with the certificate of the registration of your company overseas, valid passport of the owner or the representative, and they need to have the photo. When you register, it is the same requirement when you register for the company, the brand, or the rep office in Cambodia. And the last required document is referred to the bank account, which we refer to the letter confirmation from the bank overseas to confirm your bank account in the foreign country. And those kind of document can be in foreign language, but make sure that when you register, you need to have a translation into Khmer or the English. Next one is how much for the registration fee. In this slide, you can see that the fee for registration, the same with the registration of the company in Cambodia, is 400 million real, which is approximately 100 USD. And for the tax update on the company information representative is the same as well. It's 50 USD for the tax update. So after you register, by the Prakas, it say that from the 7 to 10 working days, the GT will issue you with the registration, we call simplified VAT registration document, and those include the certificate to recognize that you are successfully registered for VAT. Second is the tax registration cards, and the last document is the notice of complete tax compliance. It refers to the letter which indicate that from which month you have obligation to pay the VAT. And please note that for the non-resident that they register for the VAT purpose must be under the control of the Department of the Taxpayer. And for the important key point with respect to this VAT registration, you know, the GDT, they have the right, they have the right authority to have a unilateral registration of the non-resident supplier who they are not, if they meet with the criteria to register and they don't come to register. This is based on the Prakas 542. So I think that's it for the brief update on the procedure for the simplified VAT registration. So we just hopefully that since this Prakas was effective since September, this month, so we hopefully the GDT will provide the notification or instruction on this VAT implementation very soon, especially for the portal for the online VAT registration. So that's it for this point. And next next slide. Yes, for the next slide. For this point, as Bong Jali has mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, for me, the next point that I will provide the brief update on the recent development for the tax on salary. I believe everyone has been aware on this point. It refers to the Prakas 543, which issue early this month as well. Issue on the same date with the Prakas VAT on the e-commerce implementation. So everyone really want to know what are the key change on this Prakas comparing to the previous Prakas tax on salary 1173, which issue in, if I remember correctly, in September 2003. So it almost, let's say, almost 18 years. So you may wonder what are the key changes so that you can be ready for yourself to prepare to calculate the tax on salary and fringe benefit correctly without having any further tax underpaid tax or tax issue during the future of the tax audit. So here, can you move to the next slide and you will see what we will discuss this morning. So it's the agenda for this slide. First, I will provide, we will go through together point by point on the definition, on the employer-employee relation. Also, we will discuss briefly, very brief only, because I believe that everyone has been aware how to implement this tax. Just a alert, and we can say just a kind reminder to you again on the residency rule, the type of the taxable salary, the calculation. And next slide, we will also discuss on the content for the tax on fringe benefit. We also have the example on that point. And of course, when we go to each point, we will also indicate on the amended point or the change for the tax on salary for your awareness. Okay, can we move next, please? Okay, so can we move to the next slide? This one I already explained earlier. Here is the key definition under the Prakas tax on salary. So as you can see that there are two colors. You maybe wonder why we have two colors here. Actually, for we can say the black sentence, we just want to inform you that for the red sentence, it refers to the new, which from our reading, we have noted that this is the new update, and we can say the additional clarification from the GT on the Prakas tax on salary. So let's see what is the key change. So here the salary is still the same under the previous, the terminology is still the same comparing to the previous Prakas. The salary still include the salary, remuneration, indemnity, bonus, overtime, compensation, and other benefit which is paid directly or indirectly to the employee for their employment service. And the salary, everyone know that it refers to the wage, either it provide hourly rate, weekly, or monthly or daily basis. And for the new Prakas, it have include additional term of the salary, which refer to the risk allowance regarding to the work origin or health, which the employer provide to employee, family allowance, and the back pay. Also here, the Prakas provide detailed explanation about remuneration, which refer to the reward for service for the employee to work in the company. It also provides the definition of indemnity, which previously it does not mention about this definition. So here indemnity, it refers to the functional indemnity. We have indemnity under the FDC, what we call a fixed duration contract. Under the labor law, everyone have been aware it should be 5% of the total salary and fringe benefit, but cannot be more than 6 months of the salary payment. And the indemnity for the UDC, we call indemnity for under the unfixed duration contract. For now, because now it called a seniority. And we have the indemnity for dismissal and other indemnity which the employer can provide to the employee. Next slide, please. Here for the bonus, now it also the GDT, the Prakas 543 also provide the definition of the bonus. We refer to the bonus compensation. I mean for extra payment. Overtime, the Prakas also provide a definition for overtime compensation, which refer to the allowance that paid to the employee. And also the Prakas, previous Prakas, if we look at previous Prakas, it does not mention what is international organization. So I remember that previously there are a lot of discussion and we have received many questions from the NGO, whether they said whether they should recognize as international organization or the foreign organization. So the Prakas now provide the definition of the international organization, which refer to the organization that coming from, by bilateral agreement between the government and government. Those can be, for example, we have like for the JICA, we have USAID, yes, those kind we call international organization. And also in the Prakas, it has provided the definition of differential salary, which it refers to the salary that is received for the performance of the work outside of Cambodia. For the other term, like employer, employee, and Cambodian source salary, is still the same definition under the Prakas 1173. So can we move to the next slide? The next slide, we will discuss on the residency rule. For this slide, you can see the red color again, right? So here, you know that the employee, they consider as the resident if they meet one of the three following conditions. First, they can the individual must have a resident in Cambodia, meaning like they have a house, rent an apartment, or they have a I mean, buy any house that they expected to live in Cambodia. And secondly, the person must have a place of abode in Cambodia. And the third point, which is everyone, I believe everyone have been aware, is the person must be presented in Cambodia more than 182 days, which is around 6 months in any 12 in any 12 calendar year. And actually, the Prakas, this new Prakas have provided additional information that in case the employer or you could not identify that the individual fall under category 1 or category 2, or because the category 3 is the last, I mean, will be the last requirement to the employer to make judgment whether their employee is a resident or non-resident. So it's very important that you first, when you calculate the tax on salary, you need to understand whether he or she is a resident or non-resident employee, because the tax on salary rate that apply to resident and non-resident and other conditions are not the same. In the next slide, we will see what are the different. So can we move next? Can we move to the next slide, please? Yes, and here is a little bit discussion on the employer and employee relation. It does not change with the previous Prakas. It's still stated that the individual that fulfill any two of the following criteria, it must be considered as having the employer and employee relation. So the four condition here, it refers to the condition that they not having any risk of receive compensation when they engage, when the individual they have enter into the contract agreement with the employer, whether in verbally or writing. Secondly, the individual cannot fix their workplace or time. And thirdly, they do not need to spend the money to buy their working equipment like laptop or desk or something. And the last point is that the person cannot provide the employment service to many persons at the same time. So next slide, please. For the next slide, here is the residency rule. So it's just to provide you just not an update, just a reminder that residents must be subject to Cambodian source salary and foreign source salary, whereas the non-resident is subject to only Cambodian source salary. And you know on these definitions in the first slide of this topic. So can we move next, please? So I will go a bit fast for this point because it's the same with the previous Prakas. It's just to show you that the taxable salary must include the salary, remuneration, indemnity, premium, overtime, and compensation. And all kinds of these points have been explained and provide detailed explanation on the key term on the definition slide. So I believe that you have been aware on what kind of the salary, if you made a payment to employees, shall be included as taxable salary, which is subject to the tax on salary. And for the resident employee, Yes, and for the resident employee, you can see here that they subject to both Cambodian and foreign source salary. Secondly, any advance or loan that the employer pay to the employee, it also must be included in the taxable salary as well. Can you move to the next slide? We show the table. Okay, here that's why in the previous slide, when we talk about the resident condition, we need to understand clearly because there is a different tax rate for the tax on salary for the resident and non-resident. As you can see in this slide and the table, for the resident, it subject to the progressive rate. You can see from 0 to 20%, whereas the non-resident, they will be taxed at the flat rate of 20%. Next slide, please. In addition to that progressive rate, the resident also can have the rebate of 150,000 Khmer Ringgit for the housewife and the dependent children. The condition of the dependent children you can see in this slide. And you move to the next. Okay, now we see the red color again. So for the TOS exemption is the first point about the refund for the professional expense, as long as you meet with the 3 criteria, of course, it will be exempt from the tax on salary. Additional remuneration under the labor law, also not subject to the tax on salary. The supply for the uniform, which is necessary for the employee to perform their work, also not subject to the tax on salary. And the flat allowance for the mission and travel for business also not subject to tax on salary. And one more thing that you can see the red color here, because I just want to make your attention that previous Prakas, they just mentioned only indemnity for being laid off. But now the Prakas 543, they have included the term other, meaning other indemnity which provide to the employee for being laid off under the labor law. It will not be subject to the tax on salary. So in this case, you need to understand what kind of other indemnity that provide under the labor law for being laid off. In this case, you can define whether it's subject to tax on salary or not. Okay, can you move to the next slide? The next slide, it continue on the tax on salary exemption. It is the same with the previous Prakas, as you do not see any red color, right? So when the individual employee, they can be exempted from the tax on salary if he or she is not a resident, the first point. Secondly, they receive the salary from the employer who is not a resident in Cambodia. And third point, the salary that borne by the salary does not recharge back to the Cambodia entity. So make sure that if the employee individual they fall under the 3 conditions, of course their tax on salary, they do not subject to the tax on salary. In addition, for the salary of the diplomatic or the foreign official or the employee of international organization like JICA or other agency, of course, their salary also not subject to the tax on salary. And the Senate and also National Assembly also not considered as the employee, which is subject to the tax on salary as well. Okay, here actually this one, the seniority, actually it's not mentioned in the Prakas 543, but because I have discussed about the tax on salary exemption, this point I raised today because I just want to I just want all of you to get attention on the seniority payment, which is under the part of the tax on salary as well. So this circular 002, which issue I remember in 2020, it provides a clarification that for the seniority payment that the employer provide to the employee more than 4 million Khmer Ringgit, which is around 1,000 USD. The excess amount, only the excess amount will be subject to the taxable salary. I mean, will be included in the taxable salary and subject to the tax on salary. So here in this slide, you can see that, and you know that normally the seniority will be made with 2 times a year. So meaning that if the first time of the seniority payment is more than 2 million, of course, the excess amount will be subject to tax on salary. And also the second seniority, again, if your seniority payment is higher than 2 million, the excess amount will be subject to tax on salary as well. And prior the circular 002, just want to take note for you, there is a circular 003 which issued in 2019 and provide clarification that for the seniority back pay and the seniority for 2019, it exempted for the payment to the employee, Cambodian employee only, not include the foreign employee. For this point, please do not worry. If you could not follow my explanation, we will have the example in the next slide. Okay, can we move next, please? Here, as I promised, in this example, we will have a example of the tax on salary and seniority payment calculation, assuming that individual is not married and he or she received the seniority of lower than 2 million. So in this example, you can see that their salary is 4 million and their seniority for the first time is 1.5 million, so it's below 2 million. In this case, the amount of seniority payment does not include in the taxable salary. When we calculate the tax on salary, we just focus on this monthly salary that he or she received, which is 400 million real. And those amount is subject to the 10% tax on salary rate. So as a result of this calculation, they will end up to pay the tax on salary 235,000 Khmer Ringgit. And the next slide, please go to the next slide. Here is another example that you can compare to the previous example, where is their seniority is more than 2 million and they are married, having the spouse or dependent children, which they can claim for a rebate. So in this case, make sure that before you determine the amount of taxable salary, you need to include the rebate amount of the spouse and 3 dependent children, and also the excess amount for the seniority payment. So in this example, you can see that their seniority payment is received is 2.5 million Khmer Ringgit, so you know more than 2 million, right, as we discussed before. So the 500,000 Khmer Ringgit must be included in the taxable salary, and then that's why you can see in the answer section, you can see that we need to deduct 500,000 Khmer Ringgit and then minus the rebate. So it ends up to see that the taxable salary that subject to tax on salary is only 5,900,000 only. And as a result of this calculation, the required to pay the tax on salary is 4,025, 400, it's around, it's around 100 USD. We can tell it's easy to understand. Okay, can we move to the next one? The next one is about the tax on fringe benefit. I believe most of you, maybe everyone have know all these fringe benefit criteria. So we just see here on the red color for the new point, which we understand it is the new additional or new condition for the fringe benefit. So here it mentioned that if the employer provide any share plan, part of the share of the company or register company to the employee, it will be subject to the fringe tax on fringe benefit. So meaning that if the company provide the share to employee, let's say for free or at discounted share price, of course, the amount of the variance between the discount and the actual share price or the free which is determined based on the market rate of the share value, will be subject to the tax on fringe benefit. We noticed that why the GDT include this point, because previously there's a lot of discussion from the private company to the GDT. When they have provided the share option or of the company to the employee, either in free or discounted, whether those provided benefits should be considered as part of the taxable salary or the fringe benefit. But now under the Prakas 543, it has stated very clear that this kind of benefit will be considered as the tax on the fringe benefit. So next slide, we will go and see the example of this point. Yes, this is the example of the tax on fringe benefit for the share that the company provide to the employee. So let's say that the company ABC, a registered company in Cambodia, they have its current share value of the company based on the net asset is 50 USD per share. However, as per policy of ABC, if the employee, they want to buy the share of the company, they will provide a 30% discounted share. So meaning that the employee just spend only 35 USD to pay the share, to buy the share of the company. So in this example, let's say Mr. P, who is the employee of the company ABC, and she wants to buy 10 shares of the company. So meaning she will spend only 350 USD only. However, if we actually the share price based on the market value is 500. So how to calculate the fringe benefit on this case? The answer is that, of course, the fringe benefit must be calculated on the different amount between the discounted share and the normal share price. That's why you can see in the answer here, only the amount of 150 is subject to the 20% tax on fringe benefit. Okay, so we move next. Yes, for this point, actually just I believe you know, right? For the manual filing, deadline for the tax on salary payment and other, it's the same with the VAT, withholding tax, or the prepayment tax on income payment. For the manual filing, is the deadline is on 20th of the following month, and for the e-filing, the deadline is on 20th